US President Donald Trump has said that he's aware of the conspiracy theories circulating around the sudden death of his ally, Senator Lindsey Graham, but declared that the FBI was wasting time investigating the matter.
On Saturday evening, July 12, 2026, Donald Trump picked up the phone. On the other end was Lindsey Graham, just back from Kiev, Ukraine, exhausted from the trip, but talking about legislation, talking about work, talking the way he always talked. Trump later said it could have been his last call. It was. Hours after that phone call ended, Senator Lindsey Graham was dead at 71, a brief and sudden illness, his office said. The preliminary medical examination would later identify the cause as an aortic dissection, a catastrophic rupture of the body's largest artery, the kind of event that gives almost no warning and very little time. A man who had returned from a war zone on Friday was gone by Saturday night, and in the hours that followed, something unexpected happened. The tributes that poured in from Washington, from Democrats and Republicans, from people who had agreed with Graham and people who had spent decades disagreeing with him, painted a picture of someone the public had never fully seen. This is that story, the last phone call, the final trip, the unlikely friendships, and the question his death leaves unanswered: can anyone fill the space he occupied? The final days, Ukraine, then home, then gone. Graham died hours after returning from a trip to Ukraine. He had been in Kiev on Friday, photographed there, visible on the ground, doing what he had done throughout the war, showing up. Graham was one of the most consistent and outspoken Senate voices in support of Ukraine's defense against the Russian invasion. He had traveled there multiple times. He believed American support for Ukraine was not charity, but strategic necessity, and he said so repeatedly, in public and in private. The trip to Kiev on Friday was one more instance of that commitment, and then he flew home. Graham was also instrumental in enacting President Trump's policy and staffing priorities. After first starting out as a fierce Trump critic, Graham died Saturday night from a brief and sudden illness, his office said in a statement. According to the medical examiner, the preliminary examination found Graham suffered an aortic dissection due to arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease. An aortic dissection is a tear in the inner layer of the aorta, the main artery carrying blood from the heart. It can develop rapidly and without warning. For a 71-year-old man who had just completed a transatlantic trip to an active conflict zone and returned home, the physical stress of those final days may have been a contributing factor. The medical examiner's report noted it was pending full toxicological results. What is documented is that a senator who was photographed in Kiev on Friday was dead by Saturday night. The last phone call. Trump said he spoke with the senator Saturday evening, and that could have been his last call. Trump's recollection of that conversation, shared publicly in the hours after Graham's death was announced, described a man who was tired from the Ukraine trip but focused on work, not resting, not stepping back, talking about the Save America Act, the legislation Graham had been pushing, talking about what needed to happen next. Trump shared a remembrance on his Truth Social platform. Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the greatest people and senators I have ever known, is dead. He was always working and was a true American patriot. That phrase, "he was always working," is the detail Trump returned to repeatedly. Not the legislative victories, not the political battles, the relentlessness, the refusal to stop even when stopping would have been understandable. A man who had just come back from Ukraine, who could have rested over the weekend, who instead picked up the phone and talked about pending legislation. That was the last conversation Trump had with him, from fierce critic to closest ally. The Trump-Graham relationship is one of the more remarkable political transformations of the modern era, and understanding it matters for understanding the scale of what Graham's death removes from Washington. During the 2015 and 2016 Republican presidential primary, Graham was one of Trump's most vocal critics. He was sharp, pointed, and public about his concerns. Trump answered with characteristic sharpness of his own. Few political observers at the time would have predicted what came next. An adaptable and sometimes controversial dealmaker, Graham was the last surviving member of an influential group of Senate defense hawks. During his near quarter century in the Senate, Graham was also instrumental in enacting President Trump's policy and staffing priorities, after first starting out as a fierce Trump critic. The transformation was gradual and then total. Graham became one of Trump's most reliable Senate allies. He campaigned for him. He defended him in the Senate. He shaped legislation that reflected Trump's priorities, and Trump, in turn, endorsed Graham's 2026 re-election campaign early and publicly, before any primary challenge had materialized. Trump in March endorsed Graham for re-election, despite disapproval from some conservatives. What made this alliance work beyond political convenience was something Graham brought to it that was genuinely rare: the ability to communicate across divides. Trump understood that Graham could get into rooms he could not, have conversations that his more combative allies could not have, and bring back information and agreements that required a particular kind of relationship building over time. That specific skill is not something that can be appointed or elected into someone else. The bipartisan reaction and what it reveals. The tributes that arrived from across Washington in the hours after Graham's death were notable, not for what they said, but for who was saying them. Senate Majority Leader John Thune, RSD, called Graham a strong advocate for the United States and a strong ally to freedom-loving countries across the globe. That was expected. What was not expected, or at least what the public rarely gets to see, was the reaction from the other side. Democratic senators who had spent years opposing Graham's legislative priorities paused those disagreements to describe someone they had genuinely known and genuinely valued. Senator Cory Booker, who had worked with Graham on criminal justice reform that helped produce the First Step Act, expressed genuine shock at the loss. Senator Amy Klobuchar remembered his enthusiasm for public service and recalled traveling overseas with him, describing an excitement for representing the country that never seemed to fade. Senator Adam Schiff acknowledged Graham's strong support for Ukraine. Senator Mark Warner praised his dedication to national security. Senator Elizabeth Warren, despite years of policy disagreement, remembered Graham as someone who always approached negotiations with humor and respect. These are not the tributes you write for someone you merely tolerated across an aisle. These are the tributes you write for someone you actually knew and actually valued, even when you voted against everything they stood for. That gap between Graham's public image as a fierce partisan warrior and the private reality described by his Democratic colleagues is the part of his legacy that the headlines never fully captured. What Graham actually was in Washington. To understand what Washington lost on July 12th, you have to understand what Graham actually did in the rooms that cameras do not enter. Graham was the last surviving member of an influential group of Senate defense hawks. That group, senators who crossed party lines on national security issues, who built personal relationships with foreign leaders, who understood the difference between a political position and a strategic reality, has been disappearing from the Senate for years. Graham was its last member. His foreign policy record was extensive and consequential. Ukraine, Israel, Iran, Iraq, military affairs, support for Afghan refugees after the withdrawal. He had personal relationships with leaders across the world, built through decades of travel, direct engagement, and the kind of sustained presence that gives a senator actual credibility when they walk into a foreign capital. He had been in Kyiv on Friday. That was not a photo opportunity. That was Graham being Graham, showing up, in person, where the story was, maintaining relationships that mattered. An adaptable and sometimes controversial deal-maker, Graham was also instrumental in enacting President Trump's policy and staffing priorities. That word, deal-maker, is the one that matters most. Graham was not simply a vote. He was someone who could make things happen that required trust from people who did not naturally trust each other. That capacity is extraordinarily rare in any political environment. It is essentially irreplaceable in the current one. The vacancy, and what it means. Graham served in the House of Representatives from 1995 to 2003, when he succeeded the retiring Strom Thurmond in South Carolina's Senate race. He was the last Republican to hold a Senate seat in South Carolina uninterrupted. South Carolina now faces the task of filling that seat, first through a gubernatorial appointment and then through a special election. South Carolina Republicans weigh whether to enter the race to succeed Graham. Reps Nancy Mace and Ralph Norman have both said they are considering bids for the seat. Repellant's Ralph Norman. RSC is seriously considering a run for the Senate seat left vacant by the death of Senator Lindsey Graham. The political mechanics of replacing a Senate seat are straightforward. A governor appoints an interim senator. A special election determines who holds the seat until the next cycle. What is not straightforward is replacing the relationships, the institutional knowledge, the bipartisan credibility, and the specific kind of deal-making capacity that Graham had spent 24 years building. That is not something a governor can appoint. It is something that takes decades to develop, and Graham spent those decades developing it. Graham's death comes at a difficult moment for the Senate Republican Conference, which has struggled with a narrow majority that includes a handful of outgoing members who occasionally break ranks to oppose the president. Senator Mitch McConnell, a Kentucky Republican, has missed votes during an ongoing hospitalization for an undisclosed health issue, further narrowing the margins. The timing is significant. A narrow Senate majority, already managing absenteeism due to health issues, has now lost one of its most experienced and relationship-rich members. The legislative implications are real and immediate. Trump ordered American flags lowered to half-staff through July 18th. Trump asked that U.S. flags be lowered to half-staff in Graham's honor. Flags at half-staff, tributes from both parties, a phone call that was ordinary until it was not. The last thing Lindsey Graham talked about was pending legislation. The last place he had been was a country at war, where his presence carried real weight with real people making real decisions. He was 71. He had been in the Senate for 24 years. He had watched the institution change around him, had adapted to those changes more than once, and had never stopped trying to make thin. GS work across divisions that most of his colleagues were content to treat as permanent. Whether history ultimately remembers Graham most for the legislation he supported, the foreign policy he championed, the unexpected friendship he built with a man who had once been his harshest opponent, or the bipartisan trust he earned from colleagues who opposed almost everything he publicly stood for, that is the question his passing leaves open. What is not open is this: the specific combination of skills, relationships, and political instincts that Graham brought to the Senate arrived over decades and will not be quickly replaced. The phone went quiet on Saturday night, and Washington is still working out what that silence means. That is the full documented account of Senator Lindsey Graham's final days and the response his death has generated. Sourced from NBC News, The Washington Post, NPR, Fox News, and multiple verified outlets. Here is what I want to know from you. When you think about Lindsey Graham's career, the evolution from Trump critic to trusted ally, the bipartisan relationships, the Ukraine trips, what do you think his defining legacy actually is? The politics? The friendships? Something else? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments. Subscribe if you are not already. Turn on notifications. This story is still developing. The South Carolina Senate vacancy, the political implications, Trump's next steps, and the verified account will be here when it does. Thank you for watching.